The original inspiration for the sermon this week is from a news story that I read some time ago. It was a very simple story about a simple guy doing a simple thing. Like many people, he enjoyed a daily walk through his neighborhood. It wasn't especially arduous, but for his health, he had made this commitment to walk every day. After he'd been walking for some time, he became more and more concerned about some large-scale issue. I don't remember exactly what it was. It may have been political or environmental, but it was a big picture issue. And after thinking about his limited options to create change, he decided to carry a sign with him on his walks. It wasn't a huge sign, just large enough for people driving by to see it. It may have even hung around his neck. His effort didn't change the world in one shot. In fact, his effort was hardly any effort at all. On his way out the door, he just grabbed the sign and hung it around his neck. I don't remember much more about the story. I don't remember the guy's name or even what his cause was. But I can bet you that his neighbors remembered, or the people driving down the street remembered what he was so passionate about, at least for a little while. The story jumped out at me, and it sticks in my mind as a reminder of the possibilities that we all have to make a small difference. The effort doesn't have to be huge. We don't always have to know the impact that we'll have. The first step might not lead anywhere at all, or it might start an avalanche of change. You never know until you give it a try. The first piece of inspiration for this sermon was about a guy taking a walk. The second piece was about a group of college friends going out for lunch. In 1960, Franklin McCain and three friends decided to make a stand against segregation by seating themselves at a lunch counter at Woolworth's. That first day wasn't such a big deal. No one was arrested. There wasn't any violence. On February 1st, 1960, with no prompting from any organization or black leadership, 4 college freshmen initiated a whole new stage of the black freedom struggle. Now, 5 years earlier, in 1955, when McCain was 14 years old, he was particularly disturbed by the murder of Emmett Till. That name is probably familiar to some of us. Emmett Till was mutilated and shot and dumped in the river in Mississippi after being accused of flirting. I want to repeat that, flirting with a white woman. 4 years later, McCain headed to college in Greensboro, North Carolina. He studied regularly with his 3 good friends, Jimbriel Kazan, David Richmond, and Joseph McNeil. And their study sessions sometimes turned into much heavier discussions as these 4 young black men dealt with the disillusionment from what their parents had told them for so many years. They had been told that if they were polite, worked hard, and earned good grades, the American dream would be theirs. As they did all that they were supposed to and still met a wall of segregation and prejudice, they found that the American dream for them was more of a lie. In 1960, Jim Crow still ruled through most of the South. There had been big developments, but at that point, most of them had stalled out. McCain said that he and his friends figured the more they just talked about problems, the more they were part of them. So they stopped criticizing the system and their parents to each other and decided to do something. In 1960, sit-ins had been tried, but they were never really successful before that. These college freshmen, though, decided to give it a try in their own town. So the four of them sat at a counter together in the white section of Woolworth's. There wasn't much trouble. They weren't served that day. The first day wasn't a big deal. The next day, they returned with a dozen other students. 5 days later, numbers grew to 1,000 students marching downtown in Greensboro. A few weeks later, students in Nashville decided to duplicate the effort, and sit-ins quickly spread to 50 cities throughout the South. In Greensboro, success came on July 25, 1960, when Woolworth's served 4 of its own black employees in the lunch counter. Those sit-ins reinvigorated a flagging civil rights movement and made a huge impact. Now, Franklin McCain, after that, spoke publicly about his experiences. Just a couple of years before he died, he's recorded as having said in one of these speeches, "Never ask permission to start a revolution." I think that's brilliant advice. Never ask permission to start a revolution. You probably won't start a revolution, but you never know what may come after a first step. I want to share one more story of protest moments. This is a personal one. One of my favorite personal memories of political protest was probably the least impactful ever. Back in 2003, I was at home in Oklahoma. It was just after my time in Peace Corps and very early in my seminary days. I think it was like the peak of my idealism and political intensity. I remember being at my parents' house with a good friend when the news was delivered that the United States was invading Iraq. If you remember 2003, we were all still whipped up about September 11th with a frenzy. And our collective ignorance of the Middle East or Islam meant that the government could tell us just about anything about the danger over there and get public support. My friend and I were deeply bothered by the idea. So that day, the day of the invasion, we went and had a 2-man protest. It was a beautiful spring day, so we made a picnic and went to a nearby park that faced a busy street. I don't know what our signs said, but I'm certain they were huge and made our opinions very clear. It was just a few hours, an impromptu protest on a day that we didn't have anything else planned. I don't know if it made any difference, but I'm glad 15 years later I can say the day it all started, I did something to oppose the war. Now, in the past few months, I've given several sermons about doing something. This is kind of a continuation of Christmas Eve, if you were here, whether it's political or local. And I realized I haven't spent as much time talking about why. Particularly as Unitarian Universalists, why bother with protests or doing our part or reaching out to our neighbor? As Unitarian Universalists, what compels us to make a difference? There are 2 related reasons why our faith compels us to lean in. Now, every faith tradition that I know of comes with some recommendations for living. There are some prohibitions from things that should not be done, and some prescribed tasks to accomplish from time to time. Some traditions are quite demanding that way, or at least they seem demanding from outside observers. The Muslim requirement to pray 5 times a day and make a pilgrimage to Mecca if you can afford it seems pretty intense. The rules that Orthodox Jews live by and the ways they celebrate their faith can also seem overwhelming from the outside. But Unitarian Universalists are part of this religious mix. We're not as explicit about our expectations, but they're there. We push one another to take care of our fragile environment and to defend marginalized people. We strive to open our hearts and minds to people whose lives are different from our own, not just in theory, but in practice. And we place a very high value on education and greeting the world with curiosity. Now, we may not have a hard and fast rule book for daily life like some traditions do, but Unitarian Universalism comes with its share of expectations. Now, there are two underlying motivations for these expectations. The first is a sense of gratitude for the goodness of life and for life itself. Religious life is about recognizing and responding to something bigger than ourselves. While nearly every faith tradition comes with some expectations of behavior, none of them, or at least none that I know of, place the responsibility for saving our world on the shoulders of any person. In the midst of all those rules, even among the most daunting of religious traditions, it's never suggested that the individual person is responsible or capable of saving the world. Rather, our faith invites us to respond with gratitude. It encourages us to be open to the sacred in our midst, to recognize the goodness of life, and to participate in this unfolding creative process that we get to be a part of. It's not all up to us, but we can't ignore our good fortune or the simple gift of being alive. In this way, our calling to care for our neighbors and for our world is very, very similar to every religious tradition. We're not taking responsibility for the saving the world. We're aligning ourselves with powers that are greater than ourselves. Now, the second piece of motivation is more particular to Unitarian Universalism. It relates to our first principle, the one that everyone can remember. It's about the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Back in the late 1800s, when our faith tradition was bubbling up in America, it was against a backdrop of the Second Great Awakening. It was a time of religious fervor in America. Fervor that it was about how horrible and awful human beings were and how much we needed saving. Our predecessors had a very different vision, though. They saw and advocated for the tremendous potential in every human being. They didn't suggest that everyone was perfect or even necessarily good, but they saw potential for every person to flourish into something beautiful and unique. That was the reason they spoke out against slavery and protested for women's suffrage. Human potential was their motivation for providing access to education for children and for more humane working conditions. They believed, and we believe, that the intellectual and moral potential of every single human being is immeasurably good. If you believe in God, it's certainly a part of what God created. If you don't believe in God, you must acknowledge that our human capacity for reason and love is one of the most exquisite things in the universe. And we're compelled to do what we can to ensure that each person has the basic resources to thrive as a thinking, feeling, whole human being. So those structures of racism, classism, sexism, and all the other isms are unacceptable because they inhibit whole segments of humanity from reaching their full potential. So as we dive into a new year with a swirl of political motivations and resolutions and liberal guilt and to-do lists as long as our arms, let us remember that the job is not ours alone. We're not responsible for saving the world. We are responsible for responding to the goodness in our midst and recognizing the invaluable beauty of each and every human soul. We're called to defend the basic opportunities of food, education, and safety for those souls to reach their full potential. I know in theological language it sounds overwhelming, right? Souls and human potential and goodness of creation. So think of it as lunch and a walk. Get creative with the little opportunities to make a difference. If we always waited for the right time, the right place, the right impact, the right audience, the right words, we would never get out the door in the morning. Don't ask permission to start a revolution. You probably won't. But you never know how far your efforts might spread. Amen.